Welcome everyone to our Tuesday class. This is being remotely broadcast um, from for the Family History Center, Sandy Granite. And today's instructor is Debbie Weaver. She'll be presenting a class called Using DNA Results for Family History. And Debbie has been a wonderful Temple and Family History consultant for us at the Sandy Granite Family History Center since 2015, and she's taught a number of classes for us. So we will have some chat time available at the end of the presentation, and I'll turn the remainder of the meeting over to Debbie.
Okay, here we go. So this class today is talking about using DNA results for family history, which is probably my favorite subject. And I'm really excited to share some of the stories that I don't normally get to share. I have gotten permission to use most of what I am sharing. So we'll go ahead and let's just make sure everything works. If you do have questions or want links following the presentation, you can always email me at jeanweaverdw@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to share anything that I can. So the first thing I want to talk about is resources, and that you really are going to have to educate yourself to use DNA in conjunction with your genealogical research. But there are a ton of resources out there. I'm not going to go into depth on the actual DNA part of it, but in how I've utilized it to help solve, or in some of the cases that we're working on right now. One of the best sources is the ISOG Wiki, which stands for the International Society of Genetic Genealogy. It's at isog.org. And when I was just beginning, I thought the website was a little overwhelming, so I didn't typically send beginners there. But there is a section that is for beginners. It's Beginner's Guide to Genetic Genealogy. And it has a lot of great links and sources that you can go to get an understanding. And I just realized I'm going to be in big trouble because I forgot to add in here the FH guide, which also has a section that will link you to a lot of these resources. The BYU Family History Library just put out a series of 4 parts called DNA Kindergarten about, I don't know, in just the last few months with Bonnie Belza, which is a really good beginner course explaining, and of course it takes 4 sections, which will outline different aspects of using DNA for genealogy and go into a little bit more detail than I can today. So I recommend that. I also really like Kelly Wheaton's Beginner's Guide to Genetic Genealogy. Her site is a blog-based site, and she has a lot of really good information and breaks it down quite simply and basic. So, but those are just a few of the examples of places that you can go. There really are literally thousands of places that you can go to get started and learn. Focus on beginning, and then as you go, you can get more advanced information. So this is definitely a line upon line type of process, but you just have to jump in. So the first question whenever you start to do any type of research is, what is your goal? And you have to have a research question, and that's no different when you're using DNA, but probably more important when you are using DNA. For example, you have to kind of know what you want to learn. Is it that you're interested in doing some surname research? Do you want to break down a brick wall or solve some sort of family mystery? How far back in your family tree does your brick wall go? What's the ancestral pattern going back to that brick wall? Does it go through your mother's line or father's line, or does it zigzag in between? And or maybe you're just primarily interested in your ethnicity, and so that might be a question. And sometimes the ethnicity can be helpful. In my case, most of the time it has not been as helpful as I would have liked, but it certainly is another clue. So we do have to talk about DNA and some of the basics just to explain how you can use those in real life cases. So I'm going to explain what it can do first. It can definitely provide clues for your research. It can help to verify a traditional paper trail research. It can validate or disprove family stories or theories. It can reveal previously unknown relationships. It can connect you with close and extended relatives. and it can help break through those brick walls, and it can confirm a relationship between two people. And I would say that DNA has proved valuable in every one of these instances for me, and I have stories and cases more than I could outline today showing how it has been useful in all of those. But we have to talk about what it won't do. It won't magically solve your family mysteries. Sometimes people take a DNA test and they think that they'll just log in and automatically their tree will just appear and everything will be in order. And that's not the case. It actually takes some work and time, and it won't take the place of traditional research. It's simply another source or another tool that you're going to put in your tool bag. There are different types of DNA tests that you can take, and they each have benefits and or pluses and minuses. So we'll talk a little bit about those. The first and most commonly known is the autosomal DNA test, which also has kind of a subset of xDNA that you can get at certain companies. There's a Y-DNA test and a mitochondrial DNA test. And these are the three basic tests that are used for genealogical or family history research. I'm going to go a little bit more into detail. So autosomal DNA basically is good for about 5 to 8 generations on both sides, but not every, I think you can document second cousins for sure with DNA and third cousins, but as they get further and further away, you will have many cousins that you won't share DNA with just because of what's called recombination. And so as your DNA gets cut in half each generation, some of your cousins won't get the same pieces that you got. And so it really takes a lot of cousins to paint a whole picture of a particular ancestor, and when you're looking for that common ancestor that you share. Centimorgan is a word that you'll hear all the time because that is how they measure that genetic distance. And the larger pieces or the more centimorgans you share, the closer the distance, and the less or the smaller segments, the further away they will generally be. And so you'll have to have some sort of understanding of that, but just keep in mind that lots of centimorgans is good, and less means that they're much more distant relative, and you need more of those to prove anything that you're looking for. xDNA is basically a subset of that autosomal DNA, but it can be helpful in cases where you can determine it. At certain companies, they show that. And if you're looking at chromosomes, you can see that. But I like xDNA because it has definitive patterns of inheritance. Females can inherit it from both of their parents, whereas males inherit it from their mother only. So if you share a significant portion of xDNA, then it can eliminate many lines of where you might be related. So I always look for that as an option to give me clues when I'm looking for information or places to research. The Y-DNA test follows a patrilineal or direct father's line, and it's passed only from father to son. It's really good if you're trying to confirm surnames or variations or changes, or maybe it's not at all. And it allows you to also join surname projects if you know what you're looking for. I would say Y-DNA, for the people that I have recommended it to, in most cases has been helpful, but I've even had some cases where it has been absolutely no use because not enough people on those lines had tested. But I always think it's worthwhile if you're looking up the father's line to find somebody who has tested or will test, and I'll give an example of that. Whereas autosomal DNA, they will tell you, or they measure it in centimorgans. Y-DNA, you'll get what's called a haplogroup, and that's just basically a designation by a genetic population or a group of people who share a common ancestor. Y-DNA goes very, very far back in time. It's pretty stable and has very slow changing variations, unlike autosomal DNA. Mitochondrial DNA goes up the mother's line, and it's passed from mother to all of her children. So a son could take a mitochondrial DNA test and be able to also go up the mother's line. And it's stable for thousands of years, like for 1 to 50 generations, you're going to share a common ancestor. The problem with mitochondrial DNA is that women's surnames typically change every generation, so it can be a little bit more difficult. However,
even one match, one good match in there can make a big difference. When I was working with one of my sisters looking for her biological parents, I had her test for mitochondrial DNA, and she only had one match, but it was a great match. Excuse me, I got to take a drink. That one match helped me to determine which side of the family I was looking for, and helped me go up and then come back down. So what do DNA results give you? They give you a list of matches, and those matches are basically your cousins, and you will share a common ancestor. And the amount of DNA you share with each match, excuse me, for example, will be measured in centimorgan segments, length, percent, and in the case of mitochondrial DNA and Y-DNA, well, hold on one second. I am going to mute just so I can take a little cough. It's a little dry up here in the mountains, so hold on one second. Okay, hopefully that'll go. I'll take another drink. You can cut that out, Bob. The other is ethnicity. So a lot of people will take a DNA test because they want to know what their ethnic makeup is, which is not always exact and not always as accurate, or maybe it doesn't match the tree that you thought it did. So it can be helpful in some cases and maybe not helpful in other cases. Hopefully your list of matches will also have trees of their family trees. If they know them, they might be documented, undocumented, or they might not have any tree at all. But they can all give you clues because you're searching for what you have in common in those trees. You can also use those, even if they don't have a tree. They have what's called matches of your matches, or in common with. And I use those a lot because maybe they don't know who they are. But if you match them and somebody else, that other person might know who they are. And so then I can use their tree to help give me some clues. So I would give you, I'm going to start out with the Y-DNA examples. And I admit that some of these are a little bit more, well, actually, these are all a lot more complex than I'm going to present. And I didn't have time to put it together to the degree, but I did want to give an example of each of these types of tests and how I have been using or are using them. This is one of my personal projects that I began working on a number of years ago, probably maybe even 8 years ago. I became interested in my mom's father's mother's line, which goes back to George Cornwell. And he was born in 1777, died in 1846. And just go to this. A book was written by one of the great-great-granddaughters named Faye Cornwell Bolin. And she wrote a book about Joseph Cornwell and his ancestors. She'd done extensive research. I think this was back in the 70s. And she interviewed everybody that she could, and she couldn't find enough information per se to really pin it down. She had a lot of documentation. It was great, but as you know, in Ireland, a lot of records are not available. And so it was hard to say for certainty that some of her theories were correct. So I poked around. There were 3 common surnames: Cornwell, Corner, Cordner. I even had letters from a genealogist back in the 70s to one of the relatives that said, you know, it seems like there could be a connection, but not sure how to make, you know, determine that. There just wasn't enough information. So last Christmas, about that time, I had a descendant from the Cordner line who also originated in that same place in Ireland. Contacted me because I had been working on that, trying to determine, are these the same families? And when she reached out, I discovered that she was a direct Cordner descendant. And I said, you know, we could solve this mystery. If you could find a direct male heir on the Cordner line, I will find a direct male heir on the Cornwell line. And we'll take Y-DNA test, and we can prove or disprove the theory that these families are related with just these 2 tests. And so that's what she did. I went and knocked on and found a cousin
that was a direct male Cornwall heir, and asked him if he would be willing to take a Y DNA test. He had taken an autosomal, so I thought that he would probably be okay to take the Y DNA test. And he was great, and he did, and he's been very helpful. And this other person took and went to her grandfather who was living, who was a direct Cordner heir, and he tested, took the Y DNA test. And that was kind of an eye-opener for us, because when I got ours back, it actually pointed to the surname of Curnow. And you can see here at Family Tree DNA, the matches were all Curnow matches, and there was no Cornwall or Cordner or anything. And even better for me, they actually had really strong paper trails going back to these Curnows who were in Toadneck, Cornwall, and with very little distance, which means that there were very slight differences in the DNA out of all of these different markers, which puts them pretty darn close. So that is still, I'm still working on that, and now I'm focused on descendancy research to find out how did the Curnows actually turn into the Cornwalls and get from Cornwall to Ireland, and what time period, when was that change taking place. But I'm within a couple of generations where had we not done the Y DNA test, I never would have even considered that as a surname or known to look for it. And since then, I've also had other cousins reach out and have shared their DNA so that I can get more of those pieces and more of their matches to really tighten this in. The next thing after I discovered this, then, and actually, so here it was, is we had this mystery was actually solved, that Cornwall was actually Curnow. And when the Cordner results came back, it said that, well, they possibly could be Corners, but they were definitely not related through the Cornwall-Curnow line. They were a completely different haplogroup. And so there was no connection to those families. So to me, that was a big win that could never really been solved without the use of Y DNA to help make that distinction between the two families. So I'm sure they will be happy that I'll leave their family alone and not play with their family, and I'll stick with mine. I don't know. No, it's actually really kind of fun to collaborate. And this was really a fun thing to be able to discover after all this time. So after I found the Curnow surname, then what I did is I went over to Ancestry and I typed in the surname Curnow just to see, well, do I have any matches? I should say, not only did I have this cousin, but before my grand uncle passed away, I went, and literally less than a month, probably like 3 weeks before he passed away, I was able to obtain his DNA, and I tested him for everything. I did autosomal, mitochondrial, Y DNA, because I knew once he was gone, I was going to lose a whole generation of DNA that would get me closer back. And so I'm really grateful that I did that. But what I did is I took Curnow and I started searching to see, well, is there any validity to that? Do we have any matches? And I've done this not only on the person who took the Y DNA test, I've taken it on my grand uncle and the other people who have reached out, who have shared their DNA with me. I've also done that. And so I've been gathering all these ancestors with this Curnow surname. And I am within a generation or two. I have it pretty narrowed down, except that I found out that a lot of those families lived in a small area for many generations and intermarried. So it's a little bit more complex than I thought it would be. But it's closer, and there's no way we would have gotten to this place had we not taken the DNA test that we did. So this is my ongoing project, and I'm really excited about where it's going and what we're learning. So another study, this is for a client that I'm working with, and she gave me permission to use hers. And this is a case study in mitochondrial DNA. The question that really came about was this woman named Elizabeth Cooper, who was the wife of Benjamin F. Collins and is this woman's great-great-great-grandmother. And nobody has been able to figure out where she came from. It's like she just appeared. And the records back in the South in that time were just pretty sketchy. And so this is Elizabeth Cooper Collins, and she was born the 20th of October in 1817 in either Mississippi or Alabama. I even think maybe Tennessee. There's a lot of maybes. And the family legend believed that Elizabeth was the daughter of the French pirate Jean Lafitte, which automatically intrigued me because I want to know, and nobody's been able to solve this or figure it out. But there are probably some people who say, yes, she is, she looks just like him. And there's other people who say, no, it definitely isn't. Anyway, Elizabeth died on the 15th of November in 1908, and no death records, no birth records, nothing has been able to conclusively identify who her parents were. So, in fact, here you can see that picture was posted in Ancestry. It says the oral history says she was the daughter of the pirate Jean Lafitte. And, you know, they think whoever gave the photo. And then you can see that this portrait had been saved by 10 of 45 people, but there's a comment below 2 years ago that says she is not the daughter of pirate Jean Lafitte. So that was the first thing I wanted to dispel. I wanted to see, is that true? But she's female, and so there's no way to use Y-DNA to solve that mystery. We took DNA tests. So the client, she had tested at 23andMe and Ancestry.com. She transferred her DNA to Family Tree DNA, GEDmatch, and MyHeritage. And then for the mitochondrial DNA, 23andMe will actually give you that as a haplogroup U2E2. But recently I said, if we're going to find the father, we actually really have to determine who the mother is as well. And probably first because there's so much conflicting information. And so we did the full mitochondrial haplogroup at Family Tree DNA, which gave us even a little bit more specific information of U2E2A1C, which is her haplogroup. And so given that we had that information, we were able to determine that she descends from this couple, Jeremiah Sperling and Drusilla Baldwin. And what I've done is I had to take what commonly came up with matches, a common couple, and then I started going back up Jeremiah's line to see if there were any descendants that matched from Jeremiah's family, and then also Drusilla's. Now, Drusilla's is actually much more difficult, but she is the mitochondrial match. And the fact that we have lots of matches from Jeremiah's family makes it most likely that they are the common ancestor. And that's 1760s. So that's not really much earlier than Elizabeth Cooper was born. So this is an ongoing thing. We're zeroing in, we're getting really close. But as my client said, she never had even heard those names before, would never have even looked for those had we not had the mitochondrial DNA to give us those clues to point us in another direction. So I'm really excited about this project. And in fact, her Family Tree DNA haplogroup, which further defined it, just barely, literally came back this last week. So there's still much to do there. We also did check into the Cooper surname. We checked for matches in autosomal, and we did find that numerous cousin matches for descendants of the Cooper surname make it more likely that Elizabeth's father was a Cooper and not Jean Lafitte. Now, there is still the open possibility that the mother was the Cooper, and the crazy thing about this is that she does have a cousin who literally is related to Jean Lafitte, but it does not appear to be related to Elizabeth. So it's still a very fun puzzle that we're working on, but and we're zeroing in on the Coopers. Again, most of the time period that we're looking for, we don't have a lot of records to substantiate the information. And so that's what makes it complicated because we're having to follow other family lines, try to find as much documentation as possible, but the DNA helps to focus in and tell us what can be correct and what is likely not correct. So this autosomal DNA case study is one of the very first cases that I worked on. I was newly volunteering at the Family History Center. I was just starting to get into DNA, and a friend asked if I would help her sister-in-law, who had been doing research on her great-great-great-grandfather's line for many, many years, in fact, 10 solid years. And I agreed to meet with her, and she came in carrying binder after binder of research. She had done extensive research. So basically the question is, who was the mother of Oscar Stewart, which was her great-great-great-grandfather, and also the first wife of James Stewart, who was Oscar's father. And so we started by going through all the information that she had researched, looking at that, and we kind of stripped it back to maybe there were some assumptions made on Family Search. Somebody had put in a father that they thought that was clearly didn't really add up to either of us, and there was no documentation for any of it. So we decided we would start back with the basics, put in the information that we did know, and then we would supplement with the DNA to either confirm or dispute some of the information that was found. This is a letter, or I'm not sure what they called it. It was a transcribed notes, basically, from Mary Louisa Stewart Gunn, who was a granddaughter and of Oscar Stewart. And it looked to me that she had written down notes of what she could remember. Now, if you zoom in, you can see it says Oscar Stewart, his mother's sister's maiden name, Miss Hastings, Elsie, Nancy, and Janet. So not clearly written for sure, his mother's sister's maiden name. So was it a mistake in how it was transcribed? Was it really the sister's maiden name and maybe there was a half relationship? Or was his mother's actual maiden name Miss Hastings and sisters really referred to Elsie, Nancy, and Janet? And it had also said that Oscar was younger than the girls and that he had been born in Ohio on September 20th, 1832. So what we could glean from this is Oscar's mother's maiden name probably was Hastings, but we wanted to find some verification of that. And family members had called her Anne from other records, but nobody could prove that. And there were no records to state that. And then Oscar had three older sisters, Elsie, Nancy, and Janet, that had somehow become lost after the father remarried. So let's look at the father, James Stewart. He was from Massachusetts, which we knew from census records, which oddly enough, Massachusetts has great records, birth records and family records, but James was nowhere to be found in those Massachusetts records. James lived and died in Berrien, Michigan. We knew from his obituary. His first wife was maybe Anne Hastings, who either died or divorced because he married Abigail Olin in Indiana in 1844. And we know that because of a marriage record. And then Oscar stayed with his father after he remarried. And so that's kind of the basic outline of James Stewart. So we did the DNA testing. The great-great-granddaughter who I was helping, her name's Susan. Her father was Roy Vernon and was Oscar's great-grandson. He took an autosomal DNA test at Ancestry.com. He was not a candidate for Y-DNA because it didn't go straight up his father's line, or mitochondrial DNA in this case because it didn't go straight up. The questions we were trying to answer did not go up his mother's line. We also took his autosomal DNA and uploaded to Family Tree DNA, GEDmatch, and MyHeritage.com. I will admit, because I was somewhat new at the time, I would have encouraged him to also test at 23andMe to get more pieces of information. But he was quite elderly, and I believe he passed not too long after we had, maybe within the year of that we did the testing. So while we were waiting for the DNA test to come back and looking at all the research that had been done, we were looking for Elsie, Nancy, and Janet. What happened to them? Where did they go? Why did they go? And so it had just been really difficult. Susan had done great research and had probably actually found at least one or two of the girls, but had not enough information to prove that it was them. And so we used the DNA matches, which then provided clues and then confirmed the correct daughters and their families. So it was a combination of finding records and then using the DNA. Does this make sense? Could this be correct? Do we have people who match? Can we find these surnames? And I'll apologize, this case was actually way more complicated as I started to put it in. I know I actually left out some good details, but I certainly could not have put the majority of the details in because it was such a complicated family. What we know is that Nancy Colby Stewart Summers, as she turned out to be, she was born in 1835, Wellington, Lorraine, Ohio. So that put the family in Ohio. Her death certificate listed her mother as not known, but the birthplace as New York. So that gave us another piece of information. We knew that there was some New York connection. Find a Grave lists Nancy as Nancy Stewart Summers. And in 1850 census, there was a Nancy who was 15 years old living with a Frederick and Clarissa Sharp, which later we found out Clarissa's maiden name was Olin. And you'll recall that James' second wife, last name or maiden name was Olin as well. So we thought maybe there was some sort of family connection. And I forgot to double check on it, but I think Clarissa might have been the sister. So now we're starting to put these pieces together and they're starting to make sense. And you can see there were different spellings of Stewart. I also neglected to put in there was an obituary that for some reason I couldn't lay my hand on that said that she had been deprived of her mother at 3 months old, I believe. And so that actually, now you could say, well, she was deprived because her mother died or she was deprived because her mother left. We really still don't know what happened to her mother. But another good clue was that after she married George, she had a daughter named Elsie. And you'll recall she had a sister named Elsie. And that wasn't necessarily the most common name that we came across in these families. So that was a very helpful clue. So we begin with surname searches in almost all cases when we're trying to prove something. The family believed that Hastings was the mother's maiden name, and we knew that the father's name was Stewart for sure. So we started doing searches on Stewart, different variations of spelling for Stewart, and also on Hastings. And what we did is we found several families that had not only Stewarts, but also Hastings in their lines. And there was one couple that came up that was very interesting, Garrett and Charlotte Hastings. And they were really a big key to our research. Garrett and Charlotte Hastings were found in the 1850 census for Hillsdale, Michigan. And it listed Garrett and Charlotte Hastings with Elsa Stewart. Now, notice again a different spelling of Elsie and also Stewart. It was Stewart rather than Stewart. So, and it said that she had been born about 1830 in New York. Later, we discovered that Charlotte's maiden name was Stewart. So that was a really significant clue, and we would not have come across or known about Garrett and Charlotte Hastings, not only because Elsa's name was spelled a little bit differently, and we didn't know that she'd been born in New York. We didn't know to look in Michigan until we came across a number of matches showing Garrett and Charlotte Hastings as a couple that could be related. So if we look at Elsie Stewart Routson, who she ended up being, she was born 29th of August, 1829 in Genesee, New York. And remember in that 1850 census, she's living with Garrett Hastings and Charlotte Stewart Hastings. So we're starting to put some connections together. Well, she grew up and married Andrew Jackson Routson. And he happened to be the son of John Henry Routson and Sarah Franks. Well, that was really interesting. And this brings the principle of what they call friends, associates, neighbors, and doing the research for all of their extended family. I generally will research down and then go back up the spouse's families, because that's where you can start to really build some connections. Well, that Sarah Franks, that Franks surname, we kept coming up with matches that showed this Franks surname. We didn't know how much value to put on it, but it was the DNA matches listing Franks as a surname multiple times that we kept bumping into that led us to find an 1844 marriage record for Jeanette Stewart and Moses W. Franks in Ohio. So Janet was actually Jeanette. So things are really coming together, and this was everything just felt like it was coming together between using the traditional research, things that Susan had already found but couldn't confirm, and then using the DNA, we were starting to put these pieces together to build some sort of family connections. Now, I have to admit, and I wanted to go back and find a picture and put it in here, because I asked Susan to diagram out all these families that we were putting together and their connections. And literally, they were poster-sized sheets, and we found out these families were very much interconnected. which not only made the DNA a little bit more complicated to prove, but we found pretty tight-knit relationships. We actually, even through DNA, were able to identify where an application for the Sons, I think it was the Sons of the American Revolution, where they had actually had incorrect information and it kept getting copied and copied. But through DNA, we were able to prove that that link was incorrect, and we've corrected it in our tree. So this is a chart that I used to use a program called Scalpel, and so this is where I laid out a lot of the DNA matches that we found. It's certainly not all of them, but they were critical ones because in 1820, we had found some Hastings and Stuarts living in Genesee, New York, in a town called Pembroke. And that was really key. If you look around, you can see that there are red boxes around several names, and all of those families had lived in Pembroke, Genesee, New York. So we wanted to explore a little bit more, and you'll see right here in the middle, here's Gara and Charlotte Hastings. And if in fact they were a close family member, like we were beginning to suspect, that Nancy Hastings is who we started to believe the mother was. And I know that this is not as logical as I would have liked it to have been in my explanation, but we finally determined that there was a Jonathan Hastings who had married Dolly Taylor and had a daughter named Nancy Ann Hastings, born about the time that we were looking for. And if she was the mother of Nancy, which we later found was Nancy Colby Stewart, that would make sense that Gara Hastings was a half sibling to Nancy through a different wife, and that it would have made sense that Nancy could have gone and lived with an aunt and uncle. Now, that still didn't prove it. One other thing that we found was interesting is Nancy, and we had discovered through her death records, I believe, or some records, that her middle name was Colby, which seemed kind of unique and unusual given the time, or the other names. We just didn't come across that name. So it just really stood out to me that there was some connection. And sure enough, as we started putting this together, we believed that Charlotte Stewart was actually the sister of James Stewart, and Charlotte's sister, Nancy, so oldest sister Nancy, who Nancy could have been named after, was married to Abner Colby. So all of these pieces just started fitting into place. And then, as you can see, we had DNA descendants from each one of these families that were in appropriate amounts for the relationship. Some maybe a little bit more because these families had intermarried, so we took that into account. But it was just really great to see this and to confirm these relationships, that they were adding up and making sense, especially in the context. Now, since that time, Ancestry came out with a new tool called Throughlinez, which would have been so great back then. But in this case, you can see here's James Stewart, who is the father of Oscar. And we put in Nancy Colby Stewart as a sibling. We found Betsy. We also had the half siblings as Ashman and Edgar, and you can see that they had descendants coming down that matched in the appropriate amounts. So all of a sudden that supports and substantiates that James Stewart was the father of all of them, and that we've got the right family links. You can see this Nancy, she had Annabelle Summers, and then her son was George Summers Earl, which by marriage. So it just was adding up. Now, remember, we made the assumption, we said, well, we think that Jonathan Hastings is Oscar's grandfather, and that Nancy, because he had a daughter, Nancy Ann Hastings, and that she was possibly the mother of Oscar. So then we're now looking to see, well, do we share DNA with Jonathan's other children coming down through them? And sure enough, as you come down through each of those lines, that all of the children share DNA in the appropriate amounts. And I didn't bring these other ones down, but David had 5 matches below him. Sylvia had 3 matches. So as time goes on and more people test, through the use of Throughlinez, the computer's actually figuring it out and saying, hey, we also believe these are 2, you may want to check them out. And so the last thing that we would want to do, and we haven't done yet, is to go through and do a proper Y and mitochondrial study by taking, if we can, Nancy's mother and finding any daughters that came through, perhaps through Sylvia, and then determining do we have the correct mother based on, so those mitochondrial matches should be identical. And then also going through James Stewart, that his father is who he is, by correcting that. This presentation alone would be a full 2 hours to go through all the information that we found and all the support that we have. But I would still say that it's not completely finished until we take and do those last Y and mitochondrial DNA to verify the information. And I used to use these icons that I would put in Ancestor if I had at least 3 separate descendants from 3 separate children from an ancestor. And so Oscar, when we started, all we knew is his father's name was James, and we did not know who his mother was. But now you can see that we have basically descendants from every one of those ancestors in multiples. And so we're quite confident that we have found the correct parents. And so I'm really excited about that. To come to some of the fun stuff that happens, this was a little bit of a surprise. I received a message through Family Search in April that said, as a consequence of a DNA swab, my elder son, I have just figured out what became of my grandfather, Joel Freeman Avant. And this was from a cousin named Ken Roberts. And I was familiar with the family because I had actually uploaded photographs. I hadn't spent a lot of time on it, but I had uploaded this photograph probably back in 2015 or 2014. And here you can see I've highlighted my husband's grandparents who are in the photograph. And I haven't spent a lot of time on that because I'm helping other people do their lines, and I've got some, and I'm kind of going back, not forward. But you can see this little couple here, this mother and the daughter. Well, this little girl in the picture is Ken's mother, and the woman next to him is Ken's grandmother. And this grandmother is Emma Leolin Clements, and she was actually present at the birth of my husband's grandfather. And when the little girl was just less than a year, her father, Joel Freeman Avant, disappeared, never to be seen again in their lifetime. So this was back in the 1920, 21, sometime in that year, Joel just disappears, and nobody knows what's happened to him. They go on. She never remarries. The daughter goes on, gets married, and has children, and one of those is Kenneth. And so Kenneth reaches out to me, sends me that message, and now we have a history for him. I didn't have time to put all the detail, but he moved to El Paso, Texas around 1920 to 21, which we, oddly enough, had found newspaper clippings. We had found city directories. I became very interested in this because I'm like, well, how do you know for sure that's who it is? But what we know is that he changed his name to Owen Jonathan Carson. He married in 1926. He fathered 2 sons. And then I forgot to put the death date in there, apologies. But this photograph that we have comes from one of those 2 sons' children who also took a DNA test. And this picture was taken. Now, one of the things you'll notice in this picture is he actually has an artificial leg. And so when I was first reached out, or when Kenneth first reached out to me, I was like intrigued because I had never done somebody who just disappeared. I wanted to know more. And so I did a little bit of my own research. We have a lot of the records. We have a lot of the pictures. But nobody ever knew what happened to him, so we didn't have that piece. And so I found a record for his draft registration. And in the draft registration, it said that he had a missing leg, or an artificial leg. So I wrote back to Ken and I said, well, you know, if your Owen Jonathan Carson has an artificial leg, then we'll know it's him. And sure enough, he sends back this photograph with the missing leg. And so that was just really exciting. we went on to do more research and were able to determine that some of his family members actually live not very far away from him, which makes me think that it's possible that his family did, maybe his side of the family knew where he was. We just don't know for a fact, can't find the proof. But oddly enough, they ended up living in the same town not too far away. So that's still one of my favorite little intriguing stories that it wasn't something we were looking for. I had no knowledge of, but had certainly the reason Kenneth reached out to me is because I had uploaded all those photographs. And so it's been really great to be a part of it. And he is now one of my favorite pen pals. He writes just fun stories and anecdotes, and anytime he finds something new, and I was able to find some information that actually he hadn't been able to find. And so we've been collaborating on this, and it's just kind of a fun, interesting story to know 110 years later what actually happened to or 100 years later, what happened to his grandfather that he never met or knew. So that is pretty much the end of those stories. But I just, at the end of the day, you have to think, what is your goal? You know, start with what do you know? Then determine, you know, if or what DNA tests can help you know more. And then you do have to do the research, you have to do the due diligence, and put those pieces together, using them together. One of the things I forgot to say is that in the end, we literally never found any record for James Stewart other than the few with his family. After that time, we have not found a marriage record. Obviously, we have not found a birth record. We have nothing except for this circumstantial evidence and DNA evidence to tie him to the family. But I am confident that we have the right one. I believe that the reason he wasn't in the Massachusetts records was because the family had moved to New York right about that time period, which is why he ended up meeting Nancy Ann Hastings there and marrying. And because birth records and marriage records weren't necessarily required at that time, and no Bible records or anything has been found. But we, again, the DNA evidence supported, and we had records that there was a Nancy Ann Hastings who was the daughter of her parents, and she is the right age. So we believe that we have found her, but again, not a single record other than these few anecdotal things, and a whole lot of DNA have supported that. So those mysteries could never have been solved without DNA. And so I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have been able to learn. Again, it's a line upon line experience and takes a lot of time, but it's certainly rewarding if you're willing to put in the time to do that. And it also saves a lot of time because you actually can direct your research. So, whoops, I forgot to throw out some of these things. I thought I had turned them off. Thank you. But so if you have any questions, and you can find me at jeanweaverdw@gmail.com, and I will throw the time back over to you, Bob.
Great. Thank you so much, Debbie. I love the personal examples and detective work that you put into connecting the dots with DNA research. Wonderful. Do we have any questions from the group here today for Debbie? Okay, you notice that her email address is there, jeanweaverdw@gmail.com, so you can contact her there if you have any questions in the meantime. This recording will be posted on the Sandy Granite Family History website. That's granitefhc.com. It'll probably take about a week to 2 weeks to get it up there, but you can look in the class area and find the recording for this. Thanks again for attending. Debbie, anything else you'd like to say?
No, it was kind of fun to go through and review, and I wish I'd had more time to document some of these for you, but given the complexity, I realized that wasn't going to be possible, but hopefully it made some sense to you and tied some pieces up.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Our next class is going to be the 13th of October, taught by Holly Corley. She's a family history consultant out in the Illinois area, and she'll be talking about making discoveries in your research. I think that'll tie in nicely with what Debbie has covered here. So we hope to see you then, and thanks very much, everyone.